actually also suggest to them, you know what, that's 4 recommendations, and 1, 2, and 3 are really important. 4, we know that, for instance, another country is already making that recommendation, so if you want to drop that, that would be okay. So it's those last minute kind of suggestions that you can actually make to them. At this stage, they would not always be very open to taking on new recommendations because, you know, it's a very complicated process. They have to seek approval through their own foreign ministry, through the embassy at the capital city of the country that's coming under review, etc. And then finally, and for me this is the most important part, is after the review, when you go back home. We are now in the middle of the 2nd cycle of the UPR, and we have, for many countries, hundreds and hundreds of recommendations already. The question is really now, what do we do after we go back home with all of these recommendations? What do we do with everything that has happened to this point? And generally speaking, there are a few things that have been done which may be useful. The first thing is to keep the momentum going and to not let it dissipate. It's important to have a debrief with other groups, other partners in the country after the review, to make an assessment of how the review went, to make an assessment of how the state's answers and the state's responses, and then to also engage as much as possible in media work. It's not easy to get the media to actually take up the UPR. It's not a particularly interesting topic. I mean, to get a journalist to be interested in something called a universal periodic review, it's not easy. But it's also a question of how you're framing the UPR. If you call it the UPR, it's maybe not so easy to get them interested. But to focus on some of the specific pertinent issues that are happening in your country at that moment, and to say that there's going to be the international community that is going to ask and make recommendations to your country on a specific issue. For instance, in the case of China's UPR, which occurred, you know, in the middle of kind of growing or intensifying attacks against human rights defenders. It was a way in which to kind of generate a lot of media attention by saying that there's increased attacks and threats against human rights defenders and NGOs inside of China. The international community are going to ask China about what they're doing to protect human rights defenders. And that's how a lot of attention was generated. So that's an example. And finally, I think that there needs to be much more sort of continued and ongoing coordination. I think that NGOs come together remarkably well in the lead up to kind of submitting the report and to developing joint submissions. And then afterwards it kind of fizzles out. But this network has been created, you know, there is a set of organizations that came together, and they can continue to work together for monitoring implementation and for follow-up purposes. So what we have found is that groups that are working specifically on women's rights or LGBT rights, they do 2 things. They first group together all of the recommendations that were specifically on women's rights or LGBT rights. Even if they were rejected, they still use them to monitor the implementation of them, because they can still lobby on them. They can still lobby on them either in the next cycle, or they can lobby on them because there are many things happening in between those 4.5 years. There are treaty body sessions, there are human rights council sessions. it means that they can invoke again those recommendations that were made by a specific country and try to continue to push that country to bilaterally engage with the state under review on it. But apart from the gender-specific or the LGBT-specific recommendations, they also look at other recommendations that are more generally formulated but are relevant to the work that they do. So again, when it comes to something like enforced disappearances, they will still monitor that from an LGBT perspective and from a gender perspective. And amongst their own network, allocate focal points for different issues depending on the work that a specific organization is doing. We all know that at the national level, human rights defenders and human rights NGOs are doing so many things all at once. And so to ask defenders to do a monitoring task on top of everything else they're doing is not always easy. But if they're monitoring issues which they're already working on, it becomes very easy. So, so when you do allocate focal points to follow certain issues and to follow the implementation of certain issues, it makes more sense to allocate them to organizations that are already working on them. I think maybe I will stop here and continue in questions. Yeah. So I think that the most recent example that I can give you is the example of Egypt. Egypt will come under review actually soon, in the next few weeks. Next week? Soon. It's this session, this upcoming session of the UPR. And the women's human rights groups actually followed the pattern that I am speaking of right now. They engaged with a broad national coalition to have their issues mainstreamed. Of particular concern in Egypt this time around is, again, the detention of human rights defenders and activists who have been demonstrating, and the specific kinds of targeting and attacks against women protesters and women activists, as well as the situation of detention conditions of, again, human rights defenders and then those who were protesting all these months. And then in addition to that, they submitted also their own individual submission as well, focusing on situation of women more broadly, including, and they were able to actually bring in a lot of economic, social rights issues into that as well.
Thank you very much.